Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. A while back I painted this Seraphon Saurus warrior in a Starborne color scheme, which you can check out if you follow this link here. That guide is designed more for army painting with a lot of dry brushing, and I wanted to revisit the color scheme in more detail for characters and centerpieces. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the model, I sprayed it with a light gray primer, which happens to be a very close color match to the Citadel paint Dawnstone. Once the primer dried, I used my airbrush to spray white paint from the top and sides. The result is a subtle, zenithal style undercoat, with white on the top blending to gray on the underside. You could just as easily use spray cans for this stage, or spray the model entirely with white. With the undercoat finished, it's time to move on to painting. I started off with Apothecary white contrast paint, and coated the entire model. Working with contrast paint is all about controlling where and how much of the paint pools. I like to work on one section at a time, and apply plenty of paint to ensure it flows into the recesses. Then I'll wipe off the brush on a paper towel, and use it to soak up any excess paint before moving on to the next section. You can also use the brush to soak up paint from the raised edges, effectively creating a highlight. As you work your way around the model, look for any areas where the paint has pooled and soak it up with the brush. For the next stage I made a mix of 3 parts Apothecary white and 1 part Ultramarines blue contrast paint. If you're painting a whole army, I'd recommend mixing an entire bottle so you only have to mix it once. Check out this video here to see how to mix a custom color. I'm going to paint this blue mix everywhere except for the chest, and I want to have a blended effect where the 2 colors meet. Blending wet contrast paint is really simple. Just paint a small section, rinse the brush, dry it on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to blend out the edge. I worked my way around the model and painted the rest of the skin and scales. I'm not worried if some paint gets on the weapon or the necklace, since we'll be using opaque paint on those areas later. Next I put some Ultramarines blue on my palette and repeated the same process, blending the paint a little further away from the last stage. This is a pretty strong color, so take your time when blending it into the light portion of the skin. Any mistakes will take some time to correct. I worked my way all around the model and painted the rest of the skin and scales, making sure to soak up any excess paint anywhere it pooled. The skin and scales need some shading now, so I got out some black Lotus from Vallejo Xpress color. This isn't really black, more like a dark blue shade. If you don't have this color, Drakenhof Nightshade would be a close substitute. I painted the black Lotus on the scales and blended out the edges like with the previous layers. I also painted some of it directly into a few of the folds, like here behind his knee, and between the fingers and toes. Next I painted the spikes and claws with black Templar. I think I want to keep most of the scales dark blue here, so I'm picking just a few things to make black. The claws along the forearms, along the sides and end of the tail, and along his back. You could paint as many or as few as you like. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. I want to make a purple kind of glowing effect on the weapon, and I think it'll show up best over a really dark base coat. Shyish purple is a color I rarely use, but it's perfect for this. If you don't have this color, I think black Templar would work fine too. I base coated the center portion of the weapon, as well as a few sections on the handle. Once the first layer dried, I painted a second for a more even finish. There are a couple ropes on the model, and I painted those with Tuskgor fur. Then I shaded the ropes with Targor Rage Shade. After that dried, I painted a second layer to deepen the color. Before I paint the gold, I want to add a thin black line around the necklace. I used my finest brush and some black Templar and outlined each piece. It's okay if some black gets on the necklace, since we'll be painting that next, but do your best to avoid getting any black on the chest. Next, I base coated all the gold with a mix of 5 parts Stormhost silver and 1 part Retributor armor. The Retributor armor is a really strong color, so I'd recommend starting with Stormhost silver on your palette and add very small amounts of gold until you get the right color. There's a gold spike on his back, but I'll leave that for now and paint it after I highlight the scales later. I want to shade the gold with 2 different colors, and first up I'll use Aethermatic blue over most of the gold areas. Rather than cover each section with the wash, I want to try to focus most of it into the cracks, leaving the brighter base coat showing on the raised edges. With the blue shade dry, I shaded the remaining gold parts with Magos purple. Now it's time for the glowing effects, and they're really simple to do. I started off by painting white directly into the mouth, eyes, and cracks between the scales. I thinned it slightly with water, no more than equal parts paint and water. Too much water will make the paint run and flow everywhere, and I want the paint to stay exactly where I put it. The weapon will have a glowing effect too, and I began with some white lines in the cracks. Then I thinned the paint with more water, 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part paint, and with very little paint on the brush, I painted a thin glaze here and there. I focused it mostly on the edges where it meets up against the gold. Then with a sharp brush, I painted a few lines and scratches. Starting with the weapon, I painted a thin layer of Magos purple all over, then I used the brush to soak up any excess paint from the cracks. I want the cracks to stay as light as possible. The lighter they are, the more of a glow effect it will have. Once the Magos purple dried, I went back with white and added a few dots and accents in the cracks. You could add as many or as few as you like. And then I painted another thin glaze here and there with Magos purple to add some vibrancy. You can go back and forth as many times as you like. More white highlights will make the glowing effect more pronounced, but they'll look chalky unless you add a glaze afterwards. I think it's a good idea to build up a few layers until you're happy with the results. We'll do a similar process for the blue glow. I painted the mouth, eyes, and cracks between the scales with Aethermatic blue. You don't have to be too precise with this color. It won't really show up over the skin. With the first layer dry, I painted a second here and there to deepen the color, mostly in the mouth and eye sockets, but I put a little on the arms and legs too. Then I went back to white and painted a few accents here and there. And finally I painted another layer of Aethermatic blue to tone down any areas that I thought were too light. At this stage you could base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to take this model further, so let's keep going with some highlights. First let's tackle the skin and scales, beginning with the Fang Gray. I thinned down the paint with some water into a glaze-like consistency, and painted some soft highlights on the smooth sections of skin. Then I grabbed some less diluted paint and picked out the edges of the blue scales. I'm not going to put any highlights near the glowing effect. I think that will help it stand out more. The model was looking too shiny and hard to see, so I sprayed it with a matte varnish. I want to have a blended effect on some of the scales, with the highlights going from blue to gray. So I painted a few highlights with the Fang here, and gradually faded them out. For the next highlight on the skin and scales, I used Russ Gray. No glaze this time, just edge highlights. Next I painted a few highlights on the chest area with white. I thinned it slightly and painted a few edge highlights, as well as some soft glaze highlights. I want to highlight the claws and black scales with a warm gray to offset all the cool tones on the model, and Stormvermin fur will work well for that. On some of the large areas I like to add a few extra lines, similar to how I highlight my Tyranid models. On a few of the back scales I want it to blend to the blue-gray. So I started on one side and gradually faded the lines. Then I overlapped the last couple marks. I mixed some Bonewhite into the Stormvermin fur and highlighted the edges and corners of the scales. I want the scales to stay pretty dark, so I'll try to keep these highlights to a minimum. Now that the back scales are done, I painted the spike with the gold mix from earlier. Then I shaded it with Aethermatic blue. Next I picked out the edges of the rope with Jokaero orange. I want to add a reddish highlight to the weapon handle, so I started by thinning some Screamer pink with water. With barely any paint on the brush, I painted a thin glaze along the top, followed by a couple edge highlights next to the gold bands. Since a glaze layer is transparent, that means the base coat will show through a little, so the first layer will almost be like a mix between the two colors. I built up a couple layers with the glaze to create a blended effect. Since I had some Bonewhite on my palette already, I used that to lighten the Screamer pink, and I painted a couple highlights, making each line more narrow than the previous. Before I highlight the gold, I need to paint a narrow black line around the weapon, and for that I used black paint with a little water. Then I used the gold mix from earlier and touched up any areas that needed it. Finally, I picked out all the edges of the gold with Stormhost silver. The weapon handle has this gem thing in it, and I base coated that with white. Then I painted a couple layers of Magos purple. And then I added a few white dots. I attached a couple pieces of cork tile to the base with super glue, and then applied a generous amount of textured paste with an old brush. Before the paste dried, I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After that dried, I painted over the whole base with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Mournfang brown and then Balor brown. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, washed them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil, dry brushed them with Dawnstone, and then I dry brushed them with a mix of Dawnstone and Bonewhite. I painted the edge of the base with black, and after that dried, I applied patches of static grass and clump foliage with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below, and thank you. I really enjoyed revisiting the Starborne color scheme and putting some more time into it. I don't think I could do a whole army this way, but I could see it being a lot of fun for characters and centerpiece models. I have 2 more Kroxigors waiting for paint. What color schemes would you like to see next on the channel? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.